Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. I'm tying up this clematis because it is growing inches by the day. This is one of the late flowering clematis, the group 3 type, that you cut right back to the ground in late winter, early spring. And at this time of year, they put on masses of growth. And you do need to keep tying it in because otherwise it flops all over the place. And then round about midsummer, it slows its growth down and starts to produce a mass of flowers, and will go on doing so right through to the first frost. And if you're not sure what type of clematis you've got, a simple rule of thumb is if it flowers before June, then it is not one of the late flowering ones. You shouldn't prune it hard. If it flowers any time after June, there's no harm in cutting it right back in February or early March, and then you get this new rampant growth that will carry that wonderful display right up to the top of this tripod from July onwards. Now, today is the 1st of May, one of the best days of the year. It's the first of our 1-hour programs and the first time that we are experimenting with a very different way of filming. We've had cables laid all over the garden with cameras positioned all over the place too. It's a bit like Big Brother in the garden. But we hope that with this new technique, we can bring you the very best of the program, share the best of Longmeadow at this lovely time of year, and we can all celebrate spring together. On today's program, Carol is revelling in the cherry blossom at the National Collection of Fruit at Brogdale in Kent.
This is one of the most beautiful and the most unique of all cherries. And if you turn it up, it's rather like being presented with a bouquet.
Frances returns to her allotment to start her veg growing season.
This year, I want to work my plot even harder and get as much nutritious food as I possibly can.
And I shall be potting up summer flowering bulbs and getting out all my tender plants that have been in storage over winter, ready for their summer display. The wildlife garden has undergone some changes since last year. The whole point of this area was to make a garden that could attract as much and as varied wildlife as possible and yet still remain attractive. And certainly as we're all spending more time in our gardens, I think more and more of us are aware that there's so much pleasure and enrichment to be had from just observing and sharing our space with all kinds of animals. But the problem I had was that the pond was in the wrong place, essentially. And ponds are really important to attract wildlife. They don't have to be big. They can really be very small indeed, but they will make a difference. And mine was tucked over there under the hedge. So we've moved it and made it bigger. I've made a beach, and you can see that that is a shallow area where mammals and birds and amphibians can literally walk into the water safely. And that's essential if you're making a wildlife pond. But the key is cover. The more cover you have, the safer the animals are and the more likely they are to breed. And as well as having plants on the inside of the pond providing cover, I now want to build up plants on the outside. Now, these are all plants that I've moved from other parts of the garden. They're recycled. And this first one is an iris. It's Iris sibirica. It has got absolutely beautiful flowers at the end of May and in early June, and then the foliage forms fantastic cover around the edge of the pond. They will grow in boggy places, but they'll also grow in a border perfectly well as long as it's fairly moisture retentive. I'm going to put these here, and I've got another plant that likes wet conditions, and this is a Ligularia. This is Ligularia desdemona. And you can see it's got these wonderful burgundy colour undersides to its leaves. And then the flowers, which will appear in July, even perhaps as late as August, are egg yolk yellow and really good for pollinators. And I thought we'd put this one here in amongst the irises. Now, planting them is easy enough. Although garden centres are still closed, You can buy plants online, but also there are quite a few nurseries delivering plants to your door. And if you go to our website, there is a list, and with any luck, garden centres will be opening up again before too long. Just firm it in, and then of course that will need a really good soak. Now Ligularia is very, very different, but I do love them. So right up against the edge, and pull that back, and that will spread out over the stones. Now the third plant I'm putting in is very different. This is a Lamium, Lamium orvala. It's a dead nettle, but it is the prince of dead nettles. It forms lovely clumps that are upright, and it has these perfect pink flowers that bees adore. And it will go on flowering from now right through into summer. But it's not a bog plant. It really likes sort of woodland shade. If you've got sandy or chalky soil, add some leaf mould or some compost so that it will hold some moisture. And I'll pop this in just right by the edge. All right, let's pop that in there. And hopefully that will spread to fill this area here. Right, we'll firm that in. I will, of course, be adding to the marginal plants, both in the water and around the outside, but that is to come in due course. But today, right now, it's blossom in all our gardens and parks and streets that makes our hearts sing. And last spring, Carol went to the National Collection of Fruit at Brogdale in Kent, and she found the cherry blossom at its very best.
At this time of year, Blossom is the virtuoso performer in the symphony that heralds the arrival of spring. And nothing is more celebrated nor more spectacular than the pink and white flowers of cherries. Here at Brogdale, there are around 350 different types of cherry. They can be categorised into two broad groups: fruit-producing trees and flowering or ornamental cherries, which produce flowers but seldom any fruit. Who doesn't love cherry blossom? And we tend to think that it's all there for our benefit. Although these beautiful flowers are there with one sole purpose, and that is to attract insects. This is Prunus sargentii. It's a cherry from Japan, from Korea, from Russia even. And if you look closely at this lovely flower, these little anthers hang down, and each of them is full of pollen. Bumblebees feast on this pollen, and ornamental cherries are one of the first flowering trees to open. So trees like this are a boon for nature and very, very enjoyable for us gardeners. The ornamental Japanese cherry tree, so popular now, only came to our gardens around 100 years ago. In Japan, ornamental cherries are revered, as they're thought to symbolise the transient nature of life. This beautiful tree has to be one of the most popular flowering cherries in the whole of Japan. It's known as the Yoshino cherry. It's Prunus crosyadoensis, and you see it by the thousand, covering hillsides. It's a wonderful tree, brilliant in British gardens too. It's absolutely smothered in beautiful, beautiful single flowers, great clouds of them. And then when the petals fall to the ground, it's just as beautiful, and of course, signifies the ephemerality of life. This is almost a mythological cherry. It's Tai Haku, the great white cherry, and it was famed throughout Japan, but gradually it dwindled, and eventually it was thought to be extinct. Now, there's a famous Englishman, he was called Cherry Ingram, Collingwood Ingram, who was mad about cherries and travelled widely in Japan. Whilst he was there, he saw representations of this beautiful cherry on paintings and scrolls. But then eventually, when he was back in England at a garden called Nyman's, he found a tree that he thought looked identical to it. Sure enough, it was the great white cherry, which had been introduced into England much, much earlier. It was propagated and it was taken back to Japan, and it's thriving there still. What a terrible shame it would have been if this beautiful tree had been lost. With so many beautiful varieties, it's hard to choose a favourite, but there are some standout specimens. This is one of the most beautiful and the most unique of all cherries. It's Prunus Yukon. It's got something that no other cherry has. It's got this lovely, soft, creamy colour. It's almost edible. I love the way these flowers present themselves. On the end of every branch, there's a great bunch of these, and if you turn it up, it's rather like being presented with a bouquet. Cherries come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And what's critical when you're choosing your cherry is to try and make sure that it fits into your garden. Now, these are two beautiful examples of small cherries, but totally different in habit. This one's Prunus subhiatella, pendula. It's so pretty with this lovely drooping kind of habit. On the other hand, if you want something that's a bit showier with bigger flowers, how about going for pink shell? And one of the important things when you're choosing your tree is to inquire about what sort of rootstock it's actually grafted onto. Nearly all ornamental cherries are grafted onto a rootstock which controls their eventual size. So you want a dwarfing rootstock if you want to end up with a small tree. Cultivating cherries is a very simple and straightforward affair. First of all, they love deep soil. If you haven't got gorgeous loam, then just improve your soil as well as you can using any organic material. Homemade compost is the best stuff. Some people say you should never prune cherries. I disagree. Any damaged, diseased or dead wood, take it out. And then a bit of judicious pruning here and there to try and maintain the shape and the character of your tree. And when you prune, always prune in late summer, never during the dormant period. That makes it much more liable that the tree is going to contract a fungal disease called silverleaf, which might eventually kill it. But following those very simple, straightforward rules means that you can maintain your cherry and appreciate its beauty for years ahead. To miss out on blossom, especially cherry blossom, is to deprive ourselves of taking part in a magical event. Nothing marks the beginning of the gardening carnival with such joy, nor reminds us of the importance of celebrating the moment.
I think Carol has summed up exactly what we're trying to do, which is to celebrate all the glories of this season, despite the troubled times, and just to remind ourselves that the flowers do still appear. The sun does still shine. Now, a few weeks ago, I asked if any of you would like to make short films about what you're getting up to in your gardens. And we have been inundated and astonished by the response. We've had over 2,000 films so far. They're coming in every day, and we will do our very best to show as many as we can. But let's start by going down to Dorset, where Jade Bowen has been sowing seeds.
Hi Monty and team, I'm Jade and I wanted to show you my baby plant army that I've been working on for the last couple of weeks. So this is my mini greenhouse, and in here we've got lots of peas and runner beans. More peas and runner beans because my boyfriend loves peas and you need a lot of pea plants to get enough. Then down here I've got some Brussels sprouts and some carrots. I'm not very good at growing carrots, but they do always come out really yummy if you grow them yourself, even if you only get a few. Then over here I have some tomato plants which are ready to be potted up. Didn't mean to grow quite as many as this. I got the seed packet wet and they just grew. I've got some parsnips which I'm just hardening off. I've got my pumpkins, my courgettes, my butternut squash, and my cucumber plants. The cucumber plants will stay here with me so that I can keep them out of the cold if necessary. But the others are all going to be potted up and then taken to the allotment. So inside I've just sown some more parsnips for later in the season. In the kitchen I'm growing lettuce, radishes and spring onions. I've been making the seed pots out of spam mail that comes through the post because I've run out of seed pots. Love the show guys, thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for the kind remark, Jade, and I'm very impressed by your homemade pots, and we'll be showing other films later on in the programme. Now, obviously, as well as blossom, this is the season of bulbs. Tulips are still going strong here at Longmeadow, but there are still summer flowering bulbs, like lilies, nerines, eucomis, gladioli, which if you plant now will give you superb colour from midsummer through to autumn. I've got a few here, and they both come from South Africa, but they're very, very different. And the first I'm going to plant are nerines. Now, nerines tend to be shades of pink, some are white, tall stems, and then these spidery explosion of petals. They are elegant, delicate, and superb for late summer. They flower in September. Now, I've got a fairly tall pot because nerines are a plant that like to be planted fairly deeply. Good drainage hole at the bottom, and actually this has got drainage holes at the side, which is fantastic. So I'm going to put a crock along the bottom to stop the soil falling out of that hole. And the potting compost is really very, very gritty. I know that it's difficult getting hold of compost at the moment, so you must use whatever you can get. But if you can get a peat-free compost and then add either grit or perlite or sand, that will help anything that makes the drainage sharper. Nerine bulbs are very tall with sort of funnel-like stems. And the top of that wants to be at least 2 inches below the soil if you possibly can. When you're putting bulbs into pots, slightly overplant because however beautiful the flower, if it's too sparse, it'll be underwhelming. It's better that they jostle for room. They're not crammed, but on the other hand, they're fairly closely planted. And then I just cover them over with the same gritty compost. Now, this is a bulb that absolutely loves being baked in sunshine. Put it in the warmest place you have in your garden. South-facing wall is ideal. Water it once a week, and if necessary, stick it up a bit so that there's no risk of it sitting in a puddle of any kind. And the more it bakes, the better it will flower. So that goes in the sun. Now, this next bulb, Eucomis bicolor, also comes from South Africa, but it's very, very different. For one, it looks like a sort of punk pineapple. And for two, it has very different requirements because Eucomis like to be bone dry in winter, But in summer, they like plenty of moisture. And I've got a different compost for them because you want something that retains some of that moisture. So this has got much less grit in. If you use just a standard peat-free potting compost, that will be fine. And then these bulbs look different. They're fatter, they're slightly scaly. And we'll just put 3 in there like that. I don't need a deep pot. They can be planted much more shallowly. So we'll just cover up round them. The snouts can stick out the top. There we are. Pop the label in. The nerines need baking. These just need to be warm. And the eucomis will flower from late June on and on into October. Now, I'm growing these in terracotta pots, but you can use any container you like as long as it's got some drainage. You don't even need a garden as such, just somewhere where the pots can stand. Now, we went to Nottingham to visit Arthur Parkinson, who shows what you can do with some pots, some imagination, and a lot of bulbs.
Tulips are my favourite flower. You wait months for them and then they come, and it is just like having a sea of floral Prozac right by the door. I just love them. Perhaps it is a bit bonkers planting upwards of 500 tulips in a space that's less than 20 feet long and only 8 foot wide, but today sat in here I feel like I'm in the middle of 2 beautiful William Morris curtains that are slowly closing around us, even though our home's in the middle of a town. I'm not a pastel person at all. I tried to like pink last year and the garden resembled a sugar plum fairy crazy pantomime set, and I didn't like that one bit. So it's really nice this year to have gone back to the stained glass colours that I've always loved. Cordial colours and Venetian-y, those are the colours that I really want. I've never grown freesias, but there are 2 tulips in the garden which really give beautiful scent, which smells like I've got bunches of them either side of the door. They are Tulip Ballerino, very popular due to it being quite weather resistant and perennial too, especially if planted in a border. And when it's sunny, she opens out like a big starfish. And then a newer variety that's also scented is Brown Sugar, completely different in size, like a big toffee apple goblet, but a beautiful tulip and big like a goose egg. I always want the pots to look really full and dense with lots of different textures and shapes, so I'm not just planting tulips into them. And I love the kale called Red Ball. We're more used to seeing this as a towering plant in the vegetable garden. It gets really big if it's sown now, but I choose to sow it in August, and by doing that, it can't get too big and is then the perfect size to complement the tulips. And of course, you can still eat it. The most stately foliage that the garden has at this time of year are the baby cardoons. I absolutely love the silver leaf. It goes with almost any colour and looks good all through the winter. They're so charismatic. I'm using different forms of tulips despite them being similar colours to give contrast within the pots. So Tulip Palmyra, for example, is a new peony tulip variety which I love, being of deep, rich mulberry. And even deeper is Tulip Black Parrot of a completely different crazed sea urchin shape. They both look beautiful together. And Bastia, which is like a muppet gone crackers with its petals serrated, and it's flushed with yellow and rich orange. There's one particular pot in the garden which reminds me of something that really should be in Cleopatra's temple in Egypt. It's a combination of Tulip Brownie, which is a peony tulip that looks like a lovely bit of popcorn gone mad, and underneath that is a viola called Tiger Eye Red. Each little face is laced with black. It looks absolutely stunning. The hens do an important job at this time of year. Whenever I lift up a pot, there's often a horrible slug or even a vine weevil, and they're very quick to get under my feet and peck it. They're also pecking in between the bricks to find little bits of grit, because I use chicken grit as drainage in a lot of the pots, and this spills out whenever I'm doing that job because it's quite messy. So what this garden really is the result of me being completely addicted to dolly tubs, tulips and chickens, but I wouldn't have it any other way. No, I wouldn't, Claudia.
Well, if you need inspiration to turn a bare yard and a few pots into something lovely, there you are. And the tulips this year have been staggering. Actually, tulips are always staggering. They are one of the most dramatic flowers of all. And we've got a lot here at Longmeadow, but unlike Arthur, I do like the pastel colours. I like the whole range of tulips, but not all together. So here in the Jewel Garden, I've focused this year on plums and purples and the burnt oranges. And then in the cottage garden, it's pinks and apricot. So if you know what effect you're trying to achieve, there is bound to be a number of tulips that will do that for you. Now, a year ago, Frances got her first allotment. She had visited allotments all over the country getting advice and inspiration. And this year, she is determined to make as much and as good use of it as she possibly can.
Come on, Nora. Come on. Come on. Good boy. I'm back on my allotment, which, especially in the sunshine, feels like such a tonic. And never has growing fruit and veg felt more important than it does right now. I know that lots of you are wanting to try it. And I personally here want to sustain not just myself, but my family as much as I can from this plot. And if you want to do the same, it is not too late to start. Whatever space you have, there's always something you can grow. So when I first got this plot, I had 4 currant bushes, and I've turned this top area into fruit. So I've got a huge row of raspberries. There's a pear tree. The fruit fell off that last year, but hopefully will stay on this year. And this is a blueberry, which I thought had died. But luckily I didn't dig it up, because now it has leaves and flowers growing on it too. That's a nice bonus. And this is my rhubarb. Now, rhubarb is a fantastic thing to grow if you've never grown vegetables before. And there is an old joke that every allotment comes with at least one. I have 2 on mine. But the great thing about it is it's perennial, so it comes back every single year. And it's really easy to grow. Give it a mulch in the autumn that will sit on it through the winter, and then feed it with a high nitrogen feed in the spring. And then you have these beautiful stems that you just pull off with your hands. If you twist them from the crown, you'll find they come away fairly easily. Now, when you eat these, only ever eat the stems, not the leaves, because the leaves are actually poisonous. And what I do is I preserve the stems, chop them up, stew them, and then stick them in the freezer, which is something that I've picked up from my mum, who is a great preserver of all fruits. We all have freezers full of them. That's it for last year's crop. Now it's time to start sowing seeds for the season to come. Sometimes it can feel like growing fruit and vegetables from seed is quite an overwhelming thing to do. I found a way of doing it that makes it easier for me, picking the vegetables to grow that I like to eat and pick the ones that you like to eat. So the key thing is just looking on the back of the packet. Often you'll find there's a colour-coded system. So pink means sowing indoors, blue is sowing outdoors, green is to plant out, and yellow is when you harvest. And there'll be really crucial instructions about spacing, depth of planting, and when to plant them. The key thing that I do is I sort everything, all of my seeds, into 2 groups. Things that you need to sow into pots, which I'll show you in a minute, and things that you direct sow, which means you can put them straight into the ground. And I've got some that I can do that with right now. I've been preparing this area over my last few visits. I've dug the soil to a fine tilth and raked it level. It's now like breadcrumbs and ready for me to sow. I'm pre-watering where I'll be sowing the seeds, just to soften the soil. It's been so dry recently. Now the first thing I'm going to grow is parsnips, which will be ready from the autumn right the way through to this time next year pretty much. And very hearty, very nutritious vegetable. Pretty easy to grow as well. So all I'm doing is digging a trench, very shallow, along the edge of a plank of wood. That just guarantees I have a nice straight line. These need to be in rows 30 centimetres apart. You sow them thicker than you need them, just to guarantee you have as many as can be. Parsnips have a reputation for being a little tricky to germinate, so it's always a good idea to sow them thickly and thin them out at a later date. Having this space is incredibly precious to me. But more than that, I always find that growing things, and especially growing vegetables, is a very hopeful thing to do, whatever's going on in your life, and we all have a lot going on in our lives now. Putting a seed in the ground and knowing that when it's ready to eat, it may be months down the line, the world will be a very different place and you never know what's around the corner. And that whatever happens, these will grow. And I find that a really comforting and really happy thought. Over the next weeks, I'll be putting in lots of other veg, like cauliflower, turnips, carrots, beetroots and radishes. Now, it's time to sow some seeds for the more tender plants that need protection indoors for the time being. Now, buying anything gardening is quite a challenge at the moment, and seed trays come into that. So what I'm trying to do is just keep everything that I can, recycle it and turn it into seed packaging. There are all kinds of seeds that you can sow in containers at this time of year, so things like beans, courgettes, squashes. But I'm going to sow sweet corn because I desperately want to have quite a lot of that here on the allotment. There. This one's called Wagtail, and I've not tried it before, so we'll see what that's like. I'm using a peat-free compost because I want to do everything here completely peat-free. It's also worth remembering to make a hole in the bottom of plastic pots. Seeds, although they need to be nice and moist, also do need drainage, so I've made holes in all of these. So I'm going to sow plenty of these sweet corns because you need lots of sweet corn in order for them to be pollinated. They're pollinated by the wind, so the more you have, the more likelihood you have of some nice big corns developing on the cobs. And it's 2 to a pot. Just push them into the soil, probably another 2 lengths of the size of the seed itself. As with any seeds, give them a really good soak as soon as you've sown them. Then pop them on a warm window ledge and don't let them dry out. As soon as they're a few inches tall, you can take them out during the day to get them used to cooler conditions before you finally plant them out. There. Now that feels like a really productive session on the allotment, and luckily, I will have many, many more of them. Come on then.
I do know that those of you who have got allotments have found them to be incredibly important at this time, but at any time, allotments are a wonderful feature of British life and a really important aspect of gardening. Now here on my plot, chard has been a real mainstay. This is Swiss chard, member of the beet family. Sowed it last July, planted it out in these beds in August. We've been picking it all winter, and there's still masses to come. And this is from one packet of seed. And I particularly love it as a pasta sauce made with cream. It's absolutely fantastic. Now, I am just lightly weeding because in this dry weather, it's perfect for hoeing. You should always hoe in dry weather. And the idea is just to cut the weeds off and let them dry on the surface. If you try and hoe when the ground is moist, A, it's much harder to do, and B, there is a chance that even though you cut the plants, they will regrow from the roots that are adhering to the moist soil. So this is a job to do at every opportunity when it's dry enough. Now, we're joining one of our younger viewers, Zach, who wanted to tell us all about his garden.
Hello, I'm Zach and I live in Bedford. I like my garden because it's got lots of nature in it and it's got quite a lot of flowers. And I want to tell you about my frog house. How I built this frog house was I dug a hole in the soil and then put sand over the top. And then I put kind of an old bird bath on it and I propped it up with some slated stones. And then I put loads of logs on it, and that's how I built it. And I can tell that it's been very popular in frogs because of all the tadpoles in the pond. I can't wait till the tadpoles turn into frogs because I know that they'll have a good life in the frog house I built.
What I really like about that is the way that it's a reminder for us solemn grown-ups trying to do really good horticulture just to stop and enjoy the garden and take it all in for whatever it means to you. And one little fact is that most people, I think, are unaware of how little time frogs spend in water. Most, once they've mated in water, the adults leave and then spend the rest of the year, or much of it anyway, on land. So any form of cover is absolutely brilliant. So thanks very much indeed, Zach. Now, this banana is the first of quite a few plants I've got to harden off. If you keep a tender plant, and tender means that it can't take any amount of frost, it will be killed by that. If you keep it under cover in the winter, either in your home or in a porch or a greenhouse, if you then took them and put them in the border, they would hate it. The nights will be cold, there'll be wind, there'll be rain, there'll be all kinds of stresses that they have not adapted to. And when that happens, the plant just stops growing. And that is when it's particularly susceptible to attack by slugs and snails, by aphids, even by disease. So what you need to do, and the whole point of hardening off, is a process of acclimatization. And that process takes anything from about a week to 2 weeks maximum. So what I'm starting to do is bring plants outside. I'll have them here, I'll put them around the corner, anywhere that's sheltered from too much wind or blazing sunshine. And then next week, we can start the planting. And as well as putting them near where you can bring them back indoors, it's a really good idea to have a bit of protection to hand. And it can be anything, although horticultural fleece, or I've got some hessian here, is very good, but you can use an old dust sheet, bubble wrap, or even an old curtain, as long as it covers them, and you can wrap it around the pot, and that should be enough at this time of year to protect them from any frost. Now, I'm going to repot these olives. Olives are actually not tender. They will take frost, quite hard frost, but only if they're dry. They absolutely hate being cold and wet. But I should preface this by saying that olives are under threat from a disease called Xylella. And this has been around for a number of years, but it has really caused major problems on the continent, and the government is restricting the importation of olive trees and actually other plants like lavender and rosemary that can carry the disease. But if you do buy an olive from a nursery or a reputable garden centre, or if you have one, potting it on about every other year is a good idea. I've mixed up the compost already, and you can see that it is really gritty. But whatever you can use, it must drain well. And I'm taking it out of this plastic pot, which has been in for a couple of years, and putting it in a terracotta one. Because, as well as looking better, it drains better. So that goes in the bottom. Now, I'll put some compost underneath. Right. I've put about a quarter full at the bottom of the pot so the roots can get down in there. Now, if we take this out the pot like that, and I'm going to gently tease off the old compost. Now, what I'm doing is just, without damaging the roots, trying to get rid of some of the old compost, because that will be completely spent. All the nutrition will be gone. I don't always do this, but generally it's a good idea. And particularly if it's a plant that you haven't potted on for a few years. That's it. Give it a good scratch. Right. That now has almost got no soil on it at all. Perfect. Now, when you're at this stage, get your fingers and work it down under the roots. You don't want any air pockets at all. Now, the last thing to do is just give it a wiggle. Pull it a bit and wiggle it around. And what you're doing is just making sure that every little bit of compost is working into the roots. Now, I will feed this with a liquid feed once a fortnight. I like to use liquid seaweed, but if you're having trouble getting hold of it, a tomato feed will do just as well. And do remember to give it a really good soak weekly. And don't worry if the water just pours through, because the olive will love it. Now, if you want to learn about a plant and how best to grow it, nothing beats seeing it in its natural environment. And Nick went to the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa in search of gladioli growing in the wild.
South Africa is home to some of the most spectacular landscapes in the world. It's also packed with extraordinary plants. And one species which grows wild all over the country and has been a real favourite with British gardeners for generations is the gladiolus.
A member of the Iridaceae family, the name gladiolus derives from gladius, the Roman word for sword, reflecting its sword-shaped leaves. They arrived in Europe in 1739, and it wasn't long before their beautiful blooms caught the attention of plant breeders.
But the large, showy hybrids we grow in the UK are a far cry from many of the delicate, wild species found here in South Africa.
Rod and Rachel Saunders are world-renowned botanists. They're experts in South Africa's native flora, and their work has taken them all over the country. We met up in this spectacular landscape, one of their favourite places to search for gladioli.
We've been coming to the Drakensberg since we were 16.
Wow.
And I've always had a passion for high-altitude grassland flora.
So why gladioli? There's so many different plant species in South Africa you could have picked.
I think their beauty. Some of them are so exquisitely beautiful, you actually just want to sit down and cry when you see them.
I like gladioli because they are so diverse. They're probably the iconic South African bulb plant. And then the diverse habitats which they occupy. You find them in savanna, in desert, in grassland, at varying altitudes. They're virtually everywhere.
How far and what lengths have you gone to find these plants?
Well, I think the most we've hiked is probably 32 kilometers for about 2 months ago for a Drakensberg species, Gladiolus simonsi, which we've been looking for 4 years. Not a showy plant as such, but very exciting to find it. And I think incredibly rare. It's been seen by very, very few people.
And the last time it was seen was in 1960.
1960.
Yeah.
A banshee yell went up when I found the plant.
Today, Rod and Rachel are taking me on a gladioli hunt. We're hoping to find some of the rarest species in the Drakensberg, which only grow in one sheer valley. And when you go plant hunting in these mountains, you have to be prepared for a hike. And for whatever the elements throw at you.
What's this one?
Oh, there's a beautiful Gladiolus crassifolius.
Up close, it is the most stunning thing. There's four or five different colours there. There's sort of crimsons, pinks, mauves, all suffusing through each other.
If you look up close, you see the true beauty of them.
Gosh, there's just so much tucked into this grassland. It's amazing.
Here's Gladiolus ecloni. That's a particularly beautiful specimen. It's just got a classic opening of the flowers, one opening, one about to open, and the next one in line. And look at those bracts and the colour and the green margin to them. It's a particularly elegant flower, don't you think?
It's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
It's a typical grassland species. I've never seen it anywhere else. Always in grassland, and always with that slightly angled stem.
And I note that the glads that we've seen are all kind of very short compared to the hybrids that we grow in the UK. I mean, is that typical of the various different species?
The height of the flower is determined by the surrounding vegetation. You don't want to expend energy putting on a huge stem. It costs the plant energy to do that. So all it needs to do is get above the vegetation so that the flower is visible to a pollinator.
Of the many species of South African gladioli, there are more like this, short, with small flowers, than there are big and bold and beautiful.
And the bulk of our UK hybrids are from these South African forms, right?
I think
They
all
are.
of them.
All of
I
them,
think
yes.
all of them are.
Except one, Gladiolus darleni, and it has tall, erect yellow flowers, and that gave the yellow colouring to Gladiolus hybrids.
Ah, okay.
And that's found growing at the Victoria Falls, right in the midst of the falls itself.
Okay.
I've seen it once.
The ability of wild gladioli to adapt to a range of environments, many of them very harsh, means that some species could only be found growing in very specific and localized areas, places that are not always easy to get to.
Now, I understand this plant is something you've come and looked for quite a few times.
Oh, we've come about 4 times looking for this plant, and this is the best I've ever seen it. It is looking absolutely gorgeous. It makes the hair on my head stand up. It's such an emotional thing. I mean, you just have to look at it. It's sitting there. Get a load of this. Here I am.
Which species is this?
It's called Microcarpus, and the reason for that is it has a very small seed capsule. I think the most special thing about this gladiolus is that it is only found in this valley, and it always chooses the waterfalls or steep wet cliffs. And the way it's growing in that waterfall, there are not many other plants that can hang on in there because it has a core stuck in a crack. It doesn't get washed away. So it's growing there because of lack of competition.
I guess the fact that so many of these species of gladiola are endemic to just a tiny little region, meaning they only exist in that region, doesn't that place them under threat from environmental change or pollinators deserting them?
Yes, it does. They are at threat because we don't know what is keeping them in that area. Maybe it's the little bit of extra rain that they get on the top of the hill. And if something changes in the weather, the climate, that species is very likely to go extinct because there are only 100 of those plants on that one hill.
Well, guys, I mean, it's been quite a trek to get here. What an incredible treat to see such a special plant in such a niche environment. Thank you.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to be here.
These are the young tomato plants of Costrutto Fiorentino that I sowed in the first programme in March. And they're now ready to be potted on. They've been pricked out into these plugs. And if I just lift one up, you can see that this has got a good root system. If it goes into a bigger pot, that will expand out. And in about a month's time, we should have plants as big as these ones that I sowed in January, and these are now ready for planting out. Although it's a little bit early because the weather isn't right. They don't like cold nights. So if I were to plant this out, I would do so in a greenhouse. But that's all very well and good for me. I do realise that because so many of you have spent much more time in the garden than you ever have done before, that you're starting out experimenting, growing things perhaps for the very first time. So I thought we would take some tomatoes, sow the seed, and you can sow them too if you can get hold of the seed, And then over the coming weeks and months, I'll take you through the whole process right up till harvest, which now will be in August and September. And I can tell you, that first tomato you grow, picked and warm in the sunshine, and you bite into it, it's better than any tomato you have ever eaten in your life. Now, start with a container of some kind. I like to use seed trays, but it doesn't matter, as long as it will hold some compost and has plenty of drainage holes. You can see how many there are there. It needs to drain. Put some compost into it. This is peat-free. Fill it nearly to the top, but not quite, and just shake it so it's level, like that. And that is now ready for the seeds. Now, I've chosen a variety called Gardener's Delight. This is widely available. You can often get it from supermarkets. You can look online, and it's a small cherry tomato. You can grow it in the greenhouse, you can grow it outside, and it tends to be trouble-free. So it's a good starter tomato if you've never grown tomatoes before. I would say that the other variety, which is very good if you just can't get it, is called Shirley. So the best thing to do is to put the seeds into your hand rather than trying to sprinkle them direct, because you want to space these out as well as you can. And very often I use a label. If you can space these out, they will all have a decent room for the roots to develop. Okay. And I find if you just gently press down like that on the surface, it pushes the seeds into the compost. You get really good contact, and that definitely helps germination. And then lightly sprinkle a little bit of compost over the top. You can spread that out a little bit. And now they need labeling. There are two ways of watering. One, the conventional way, is with a watering can with a rose and you spray it on. That works well for most plants, but there is a slight risk, particularly with tiny seeds like these ones, that when the water hits the compost, it pushes the seeds to one side. Another way to do it is just put them either in a sink or a tray of some kind with an inch or two of water, and just sit them in like that and leave it for about 10 or 15 minutes, and it'll act like a sponge and absorb the moisture. When it's fully soaked, put it somewhere warm, but not too sunny. Not a south-facing windowsill, because they can very quickly dry up. That compost can form a crust in a few hours if you get really hot sun through a glass window. You should see the seedlings emerge in something between 7 and 10 days. And when mine appear, I'll share that with you, and I will guide you through the process of what to do next. And I promise you, it's really easy, and the results are fabulous. Growing your first delicious tomato will change your life. Now, we've had a film from Roy Shepherd in Somerset, which shows the truth of the fact that you don't need conventional seed trays and pots in order to grow lots and lots of plants.
I decided to collect all of my milk cartons, and I'm really pleased I have, because now I've never needed so many flower pots for the thousands of seedlings that I now have coming through that I planted. I started with this, and it didn't really work because it's a little bit too flimsy, so I came up with a different design which I call a seed boat. And the great thing about them is you can carry them around, and when you put them together, they give additional strength when they're together. Obviously, I'm going to be creating hundreds of these and punching little holes in the base for drainage, and then I'm potting up my plants in that way. One of the easiest and most useful things to do is to take one, punch some holes in the top, fill it with water, and you have an instant watering can, which is brilliant. I'm going to end up with thousands of plants. If there's too many here, I will hopefully be able to share them with my neighbours.
Well, it's great to see Roy growing so many plants from seed, and I know lots of you are doing so, perhaps for the first time. And I think that raising plants, whether from seed or cuttings or division, from your own stock is the most exciting aspect of any kind of gardening. Now, thanks for the films. We'll be showing lots more over the coming weeks, so please keep sending them in. They're brilliant. I'm actually about to plant a few plants that I've raised myself from seed. This is a little tray of Angelica gigas. Now, they don't look like much now, but it will become stunning. It's one of my favourite plants of all. Fabulous maroon stems and domed umbels of plum-coloured flowers that pollinators absolutely love. It will grow to about 5-6 feet tall. And I'm putting them here in the grass borders because I think their height and statuesque quality will work really well with the grasses that are just beginning to emerge. Now, I'm going to get on with this job of planting these out, and here are some other jobs you can do this weekend. At this time of year, the weeds are growing really fast and you need to get on top of them before they get on top of you. Go through your borders, removing them individually, taking out as much root as possible whilst they're still easy to see. And if you're not sure if something is a weed or not, wait, and time will tell. There is a sunflower that is suitable for any garden, whether it be a giant to entertain children, or some of the more subtle colours for a more sophisticated border. I'm sowing Velvet Queen, which will work in my dual garden with its rich brown marmalade-y hues. I'm putting 1 seed per plug. I will grow them on with a bit of heat and then pot them on and plant them out towards the end of June. It's time to start supporting herbaceous perennials. The secret is to do this before they need it. It doesn't matter what you use, whether it's cane and string, brushwood, or as I am, homemade metal supports. Try and do it so that it looks as natural as possible, providing support, but not constraint. Well, we began the programme with the wildlife pond, and here we are at the other pond, which is dominated for the moment by the Camasias. Camasias have the most wonderful display that gets better every year. The plants themselves get bigger and they spread, and they've got this lovely smoky blue. Well, that's it for today. That's the end of our first 1-hour programme of the year, but by no means the last. We've got lots more of those to come. And it's the end of the first programme using these remote-controlled cameras. I've loved the opportunity to share the garden with you. And if you've got a garden of your own, or a communal garden, or a park, within the guidelines, do get out and use them as much as possible and just soak up their healing power. And I look forward to seeing you back here at Longmeadow next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.